雨降ってるから早くかかってこい。
Greetings, my name is Natasya. I'm a 10th grade Math and Science major from Advisory E, and I will be sharing my physics final project for this term. The scene that I chose is from a TV show called One Punch Man in episode 9. I believe that this scene is scientifically possible because there is a possibility to calculate the physics in this scene. Analyzing the scene itself, we can see that Saitama is ridiculously powerful enough to kill a huge monster with just a single punch from him. I will be covering 4 different physics outcomes: linear motion, work, energy, and power, Newton's law of motion, and linear momentum. From those outcomes, I will be covering these physics concepts, starting with free body diagram, the law of motion, energy, linear motion, and momentum. To predict what will happen, my hypothesis is that despite Saitama's weight, if the change of speed in Saitama's punch is great enough, then he will be able to deliver a punch with a huge amount of force, and it will be scientifically possible for the Deep Sea King to be deceased. As for now, this is what we know so far. Mind you that the velocity is Saitama's punch. The first concept is energy. When we find the potential energy of these objects, we can scientifically know how much energy they have stored before creating any sort of motion. Based on both of the potential energy, it can be established and scientifically proved that the Deep Sea King has a greater chance of overpowering Saitama. And from this observation, it does not prove the hypothesis. Saitama's potential energy proves that he is not scientifically possible to defeat the Deep Sea King. Moving on, this is the kinetic energy for Saitama's punch. The kinetic energy can be scientifically calculated as the energy itself can be found when Saitama creates a motion, which is landing a punch. And from this calculation, we can state that Saitama's punch has an enormous amount of energy. Different from his potential energy, turns out his potential energy does not prove the hypothesis correctly, but his kinetic energy can prove it correctly. Because with his kinetic energy, Saitama's punch will be scientifically possible for the Deep Sea King to be deceased. Moreover, this is the free body diagram of Saitama punching the Deep Sea King. We can see that the force coming from Saitama's hand as he punches the Deep Sea King. We can also see the acceleration going to the right direction following the force itself. And there is also a friction force going away from Saitama's punching direction. A friction force occurs because the more force there is, the greater the force reaction will be from the opposite object. From this, we can see that Saitama is delivering a forceful punch in a forward motion to the Deep Sea King. And from this FBD, we can prove the hypothesis correctly. We can observe in this FBD that Saitama's punch will be scientifically possible for the Deep Sea King to be deceased. Here I calculated the amount of force applied by Saitama, who is at rest. Since we don't know the change of speed of Saitama's punch, we can find it by the formula of acceleration equals to the final velocity minus the initial velocity, and then dividing that by the time taken for Saitama to deliver the punch of his. After calculating with this formula, we can say that the change of speed of Saitama's punch is equal to 3 billion meters per second per second. Finally, we can search for the force. The result is 210 billion newtons. Again, we can prove that this hypothesis is correct. Thanks to that big amount of force, Saitama's punch will be scientifically possible for the Deep Sea King to be deceased. The last physics concept is linear momentum. In this slide, I estimated the momentum of Saitama's punch. I found out that the chest of the Deep Sea King that was punched by Saitama is 11% of his body. And 11% of his entire mass, 420 kilograms, is equal to 46.2 kilograms. And the result of his momentum is 13 billion and 86 million kilograms times meters per second. From this, I can analyze that the momentum of Saitama's punch is willing to prove the hypothesis. This is because Saitama's change in speed or velocity when punching. With so, Saitama's punch will be scientifically possible for the Deep Sea King to be deceased. So, in conclusion, I can state that my hypothesis for this scene was correct. In 4 different ways, I scientifically proved that the change of speed in Saitama's punch is great enough, and he will be able to deliver a punch with a huge amount of force, and it will be scientifically possible for the Deep Sea King to be deceased. Although Saitama's potential energy is lower than the Deep Sea King, I can prove that the kinetic energy occurs as he is in motion to perform his punch, and that proved that my hypothesis was correct.
Saitama. それでこそ倒しがいが。連続普通のパンチ。
Now I am going to analyze whether or not Saitama's punch along with Boros' kick is scientifically possible. Here, Saitama continues his fight with Boros, the dominator of the universe. The ongoing fight made Saitama end up on the moon. After quickly going back to Earth, Saitama proceeded his fight. Because of this, Boros loses an arm and soon enough dies from Saitama's ultimate punch. And to predict what I believe will happen in this scene, despite Saitama's weight, if the change of speed in Saitama's punch is great enough, then he will be able to deliver a punch with a huge amount of force, and it will be scientifically possible for Boros to be deceased. And my second hypothesis is that despite Boros' weight, if the change of speed in Boros' kick is great enough, then he will be able to kick Saitama to the moon with a huge amount of force, and it will be scientifically possible for Saitama to land on the moon. Until now, this is what we have so far. The velocity is the punch of Saitama, and the kinetic energy is the kick of Boros. The first concept that I will be talking about is energy. Just like what I've previously talked about, if we find the potential energy of these objects, we can scientifically know how much energy they have in store, and this is the potential energy for Boros. Based on both Saitama's and Boros' potential energy, it can be established and scientifically proved that Boros has a greater chance of overpowering Saitama. This observation does not prove the hypothesis because Saitama's potential energy proves that he was not scientifically possible to defeat Boros to be deceased from his punch. Next up is the kinetic energy of Saitama's punch. Again, the kinetic energy can be scientifically calculated as the energy itself that can be found when Saitama creates a motion, which is landing a punch. The result is that Saitama's punch will have the kinetic energy of 1,050,000,000 joules. From this calculation, we can state that Saitama's punch has an enormous amount of energy. Different from his potential energy, turns out his kinetic energy can prove the hypothesis correctly. Because with his kinetic energy, Saitama's punch will be scientifically possible for Boros to be deceased. As for Boros, since we already figured out his kinetic energy, all we need is to find his velocity of his kick. We can do that by using the formula of velocity equals to the square root of 2 times kinetic energy divided by mass. After calculating, Boros' kick has a velocity of 27 million meters per second. Compared to Saitama's punch, we can see that the kinetic energy of Boros' kick is great enough to kick Saitama off to the moon, but surprisingly, Saitama is still alive. I will also be using Newton's second law of motion to see if it's scientifically possible for Saitama to deliver a forceful punch, and to see if it's scientifically possible for Boros to deliver a forceful kick. Beforehand, I need to find Saitama's speed when he gets to the moon. Here we know that he takes about 19.15 seconds for him to arrive on the moon, and the distance from Earth to the moon is 384,400,000 meters. Then we can divide that distance with the time taken, which results into 20,073,105.05 meters per second. Then I'll also need to find Saitama's weight on both the Earth and on the moon. We can find his mass by using the formula weight equals mass times gravitational force, and the result will be 7.14 kilograms. Afterwards, we can use that result to find his weight on the moon, and we do this by using the same formula, but changing the gravitational force to the moon, and the results will be 11.56 kilograms. Then this is the acceleration of Saitama when he landed on the moon, and the results of this will be 200,731,070 meters per second per second. Lastly, to finally apply the Newton's law of motion, we can find Saitama's force by using the mass that we found and also the acceleration. And once we multiply them, the results will be 2,320,000,000 newtons. After finding the amount of force for Saitama's final punch to bring Boros to death, with the use of the Newton's law of motion, we can analyze that Saitama's change in speed or acceleration is enormous and is powerful enough to kill Boros, despite his weight that's only 70 kilograms. Next, we will also calculate the speed of Boros when kicking Saitama to the moon, and the result will be 128 million meters per second. Then we can find Boros's acceleration. We can use this by again using the acceleration formula. The results of this will be 1,281,000,000 meters per second per second. And finally, we can find Boros's force by the given mass and acceleration that we already found. We can multiply both and the results will be 89,693,000,000 newtons. After finding the amount of force it took for Boros to send Saitama flying to the moon, with the use of Newton's law of motion, it can be said that it took an immense amount of force to take him out to the moon. This means that although Boros's weight is only 84 kilograms, he would create an immense amount of force due to his changing speed or acceleration. The last physics concept is linear momentum. In this side, I estimated the momentum of Saitama's punch, and for the mass, I figured out that the mass of Saitama's fist is only 0.5 kilograms, and the results will be 600 million kilograms times meters per second. From this, I can analyze that the momentum of Saitama's punch will be willing to prove the hypothesis correctly. This is because the change of speed or velocity of Saitama's punch, and because of that, it is scientifically possible for Boros to be deceased. Then I also estimated the momentum of Boros's kick. For the mass, I estimated that the amount of mass of Boros's foot is 0.85 kilograms. And from that, the result of his momentum is 23 million kilograms times meters per second. Now, I can analyze that the linear momentum of Boros's kick is willing to prove that his kick is able to send Saitama off to the moon, like what the hypothesis stated. So, in conclusion, I can state that my first hypothesis for this scene was correct. In 4 different ways, I can scientifically prove that the change of speed in Saitama's punch is great enough, and he will be able to deliver a punch with a huge amount of force, and it will be scientifically possible for Boros to be deceased. Although Saitama's potential energy was lower than Boros, I proved that kinetic energy occurs as he is in motion to perform his punch, and that proved my hypothesis correctly. Lastly, I can state that my second hypothesis for this scene was correct. In 4 different ways, I scientifically proved that the change of speed in Boros' kick was great enough, and that he will be able to kick Saitama to the moon with a huge amount of force, and that will be scientifically possible for Saitama to land on the moon. But surprisingly, Boros' kick wasn't able to defeat Saitama to death. This is because of Saitama's superhuman abilities, specifically his regenerating abilities. And turns out, Saitama was able to kill Boros with only his ultimate punch. That is all for my analysis for Saitama, the Deep Sea King, and Boros from One Punch Man. Thank you for watching!